Welcome to the first Austin Software Cooperative Meetup for 2024. We're going to do a book review today, Preface to the Economic Democracy by Robert Dahl. Going to be looking at the trade-offs that some people have talked about between going fully democratic and what Dahl thought we could do as far as a more of a spectrum moving forward, and some other interesting stuff. He's um, one of the foremost people writing on democratic theory. Watson, ready to
Thanks.
kick off? This is going to be a multi-part series, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
All right, this is part one.
All right. Thanks a bunch. Let's go right in here into the introduction. Let me know if my audio doesn't sound good. I had to update my computer, so we'll see if everything's good. So on the intro, we have I hear a little bit of an echo. I don't know if that's from me. Let's see. All right. So on the intro, we have here a well-ordered society would require at least three things: political equality, political liberty, and economic liberty. Actually, before I even get into that, one of the most influential people, I guess, uh, on democratic theory in history, Robert Dahl, is contemporary, so he's modern, but this guy Tocqueville, I believe is how you pronounce it. He's going to be one that pops up often. We saw him referenced in some of the other books that we've reviewed, but he's heavily referenced in this book. Um, and again, as a general overview, we're going to go through this introduction, but economic democracy, and Robert Dahl tries to drill down into some of the, I guess, paradoxes that come um, with democracy and what you can call liberty or freedom, and trying to wrestle with those things. And there's a whole chapter about, um, I guess, work and democracy, which I think that's where this book is influential for cooperatives. So, so we got this triad here: political equality, political liberty, and economic liberty. And we're going to define some of those. And we have some of these heavy hitters in American history: John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Um, when they were at the American Constitutional Convention, they were deeply concerned about political equality and its conflicts with political liberty. So here's where we meet up with Tocqueville. He's mainly concerned with the threat that equality, political, social, and economic, so equality in as much as there's political equality, social equality, and economic equality, how it posed a threat to political liberty and personal independence. Many of the Constitution's framers had been alarmed by the prospect that democracy, political, political equality, and majority rule, and even political liberty itself, would endanger the rights of property owners to preserve their property and use it as they chose. All right. So, in this sense, democracy was thought to be a menace to economic liberty as it was then commonly conceived. In particular, that kind of liberty represented by the right to property. Okay, so here are some of, I guess, what the content of the book is going to use or really add in as maybe context to Tocqueville, and maybe contrast it. So Tocqueville really couldn't foresee um, that, during the time, when he was writing, which was, I want to say, 1700s, 1800s, the republic constituted by free farmers sometimes expressed the worry, some anticipations, was the way in which the agrarian, which is like farming society, would be revolutionized by the development of modern corporations as the main employer of most Americans, as a driving force of the economy and society. Had Tocqueville and his predecessors fully anticipated the shape of the economic order to come, they probably would have viewed the problem of equality and liberty in a different light. For if, in the older view, an equality among citizens might endanger liberty, in the new reality, the liberty of corporate enterprises helped to create a body of citizens highly unequal in the resources they could bring to political life. Right? So, political equality, so that is equality among citizens engaged in governing themselves by means of the democratic process, is not the only relevant form of equality that might serve as a standard for a good society. All right. And owning and controlling firms is not the only source of undesirable inequalities among human beings or even of political inequalities. So, of the various kinds of equality that might exist in a good society, political equality is surely one of the most crucial, not only as a means of self protection, but also as a necessary condition for many other important values, including one of the most fundamental of all human freedoms, the freedom to help determine, in cooperation with others, the laws and rules that one must obey. Differences in ownership and control of enterprises, while certainly not at the origin of all forms of inequality, are deeply implicated in inequalities of many kinds. So you kind of get what the book is going to be about, this contrast and this kind of paradox and battle between this three-way battle, really, of political equality, political liberty, and economic liberty. Right? And he's just gonna keep getting deeper and deeper into the problems that arise that people kind of really Tocqueville was predicting, and some of the pushback there. So, any questions so far? Any comments so far? Has anybody ever heard of? Do you all remember Tocqueville when we were? He's come up in like 3 different books that we've reviewed. I'm gonna move on. No one has any comments. Is equality inimical to liberty? All right. So we have Tocqueville's argument. Again, a little bit about this Tocqueville book. I guess he wrote 2 volumes. He's French and was saying, look at this country over there, United States. It's amazing, or it's very interesting. And he was writing about it as far as democracy. And people reference him a bunch. And it was really, the great experiment. Uh, so political scientists love to reference this guy. So we got these 4 propositions that form the argument. Because equality has nearly reached its natural limits among citizens of the United States and America, uh, it's a testing ground for the world. So America is the great experiment, right? Uh, and this, yeah, I guess I should have highlighted this. Throughout the civilized world, equality is increasing. That was the main point of this one. He has some arguments later for that. Liberty is a good of supreme importance, perhaps indeed a good greater than equality, but the love of equality is stronger than a love of liberty, while the advance of equality is sure, then the survival of liberty is more doubtful. Again, we're going to dig deeper into this. Um, Third, a necessary condition for liberty is the existence of strong barriers to the exercise of power. In the past, liberty has sometimes been protected against concentrated power by the existence of strong intermediate organizations standing between the individual and a state. And then here in the fourth one, in a democratic country where political, social, and economic equality prevail, all barriers to the unlimited exercise of power by the majority are removed. The majority has an opportunity to rule despotically, right? So the very essence of democratic government consists in the absolute sovereignty of the majority, for there's nothing in democratic states which is capable of resisting it. So I guess at a high level, I think, I don't know why it's not referenced here, but I want to say that there's been critiques of ancient Athens, um, where I want to say one of the, you know, people in the Senate or something like that. What will the people do if you give them enough freedom? They're going to vote for crumbs in a circus. So they're going to say, feed us, and we want the Coliseum to be entertained. It's kind of the argument against democracy. Uh, and that to me is this in a nutshell. Uh, so, of course, um, you put in different, this book is about what are the different, um, what first, there's the legitimacy of democracy and putting in rules to stop that, which here is this, I guess you can call this the tyranny of the majority. You may have heard that phrase before. You have the majority and they can decide to, let's go ahead and take the property away from people, these types of things. How do you keep that? There's the legal side of that, right? And then there's the ethical side, the legitimacy side. And that is more what the political philosophers, the legitimacy side, what they're going to be arguing about. Any comments so far? All right,
Yeah, I have a question.
go ahead.
So what is this based on? For example, for although equality is clearly a necessary condition for democracy, it may not be necessary condition for liberty. Because equality facilitates majority despotism, it threatens liberty. So what's that based on?
All right.
What's where's this coming from? This
And yeah,
ideas.
they're gonna tease this out more and more throughout the book. But
Okay.
so there's different types of equality, right? And when he says here equality is a necessary condition for democracy, he's talking for one, political equality. So we all, right, for democracy, we all need to be able to reason about and contribute to our self-determination, our governing. So that's, and we need to be all kind of equal on that for it to be democratic, for it to be, and they use all these fancy words, despotic. So that's authoritarian or and all that. You obviously don't need equality for that. You can have the strong person say, I know what's best, or the smart person say, I know what's best. You all should have all of this. Well, democracy doesn't have the smart person on top saying all of that. They have this principle of self determination where everybody's equal as far as voting on their political um, rights and all that. But then the other side, you're saying because equality facilitates majority despotism. So this is authoritarianism. This is all absolute rule of the authority. They can do whatever they want. So, like, think of monarchs, kings, and stuff like that, or fascism or something, but it's authoritarianism, right? Equality facilitates majority despotism. These two words, majority. So this is what they call the tyranny of majority. So it may seem counterintuitive, but they're going to have examples in here of the majority getting together and saying, you know what? We don't like equality. We don't like everyone having freedom. What we like is for a strong person, maybe because of reasons of efficiency or something like that. We like a strong person to actually control everything. That's what this majority despotism is, right? So equality, everybody being able to vote, for instance, political equality, facilitates, it gives the ability for there to be a majority that actually counterintuitively, paradoxically, to vote to say, we want authoritarianism. And then so authoritarianism threatens liberty. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So this is saying that actual, I guess, call it liberty or democracy, or yeah, democracy can lead to authoritarianism, like, which is a big contradictory. You wouldn't never think
Yeah.
that democracy would lead to no democracy.
I have plenty of examples of it in here.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But yeah. And then there are critiques of the examples, but it's quite interesting to dig into the political philosophers, political scientists, and how this is kind of a given for them. They're like, obviously, this is the case. So what are we going to do about it?
Mhm.
And so when we reviewed Pateman's book, The Participatory Democracy, we reviewed the Inverted Totalitarianism book, where they're quoting Tocqueville a bunch, and they're all kind of, yeah, obviously this is the case. So what do we do to protect against it? I find that interesting myself. When from the
So this
outside,
is, oh
yeah,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just thinking that, about the examples, right? Maybe more contemporary. And then obviously, like if you say, oh, well, how come, a country would elect, I guess, majority rule somebody that is authoritarian. But then at the same time, I'm like, yeah, but that equality, is it such, right? And then I know that we are separating here, well, economic equality and political equality, but it's obviously intertwined, right? I can see like that majority rule becoming despotic. And I also think that, well, if that were the case, it feels to me that there's some other inequality at play, right? It's almost like thinking there, in my mind, it's like, well, imagine, right, the majority, let's say white people, right, deciding, okay, we're just gonna, switch things up and we're gonna press, minorities, right? I mean, that could happen, but there will be some sort probably of inequality already going on to begin with. And they would
Mhm.
just use that political equality, so to speak, to bring about like or extend or take it to the extreme. But anyway, I don't want to rant. But this is definitely interesting, that separating political equality from, let's say, economic equality. I wonder where this leads. Anyway.
Yeah. We'll probably get more into it. So let's see here. So we're getting into some definitions. Tocqueville, for equality, he emphasizes two closely related kinds of equality, which the author, Dahl, is going to call equality in political resources and equality of power. Relative relative equality among Americans in their capacities for physical resistance and coercion, such as firearms, military organization, militias, and stuff like that, right? So this is one kind of equality. It can't be some people can have guns and other people don't. And then by providing for separations of powers, federalism, and a Bill of Rights, the American federal constitution was among the causes which mitigate the tyranny of the majority. So this phrase here is important. Oops. Uh-oh. Messing up here. This phrase right here, tyranny of the majority. This is the whole paradoxical part of democracy. So this federal constitution is supposed to try to mitigate that, is what Tocqueville is saying, and the tend to maintain democratic republic in the United States. All right, so we got those definitions of equality, and you got liberty. How does political equality reinforced by an equality in political resources endanger liberty? Okay, Tocqueville offers several possibilities. One is mob rule or intimidation, right? Which is made all the more powerful because public opinion stands behind the mob. For since no jury will convict the wrongdoers, the injured have no effective recourse to the protection of laws. All right, Tocqueville discerned a second danger, however, in the power of the majority in a society of equals to dominate the public opinion itself by weakening potential deviance from majority views, right? And the danger of the majority will oppress minorities through strictly legal processes and the possibility that democratic societies will bring about a mass-based despotism. All right, so there's some things to pick apart here. One of them is kind of this idea of freedom of the press, right? So there you got public opinion, and public opinion of the mob could oppress the minority. Okay, well, as long as there's freedom of the press, so at least can the minority even speak, right? That would be kind of a central tenet what he's getting at, that type of liberty to try to push back, right? But this is a threat. This is a threat. So that's a second danger. That's why you can argue with these political, it's based in political science. When you start having a lack of freedom of the press and free speech, basically, then this is one of the liberties you're on your way to, historically, to despotism is the word he likes to use, but some type of authoritarian structure. Right. So, all right, let's move on here. So this is his argument. He's got some predictions, and remember, he's writing. I think in the 1800s. I forget. So majority tyranny through law. One thing also to keep in mind: there's, the fancy phrases de jure and de facto, right? There's as it's written, and there's in practice or in fact, right? And so the law, right, the legal, that's one thing, right? And that you can think of that as almost, well, it kind of splits the pragmatic, right? But there's kind of the what all power could bring about a legal system that could create tyranny, right? So that would be the law. About this. does not look legit. All right. And then I don't think we should let that person in, whoever that is, Taylor. That looks like illegitimate name. But all right. So there's the side of the de jure, right? The legal, and then there's the side of the in fact, the de facto, right? In the practice. And that you could say the political scientists go back and forth between here. And then you got the ethical, right? And you kind of think some people might confuse the legal with the ethical. And this chapter is about discerning and differentiating between the legal and the what he calls the just, but I'll say the ethical. So that's one part to try to, it's what causes confusion because they get intermingled. And but when you think about it in those two, when you separate that, then you start to see where the problem is and maybe where the solution is. Right. So now we got tyranny of the majority tyranny through law. Through law. Okay. If it be admitted that a man possessing absolute power may misuse that power by wrongdoing, by wronging his adversaries, why should a majority not be liable to do the same approach, right? Tyranny of the majority. In a democracy, a majority and its representatives may act legally and yet unjustly, right? This is the problem. In order to judge when a majority misuses its powers by wronging its adversaries, to paraphrase Tocqueville, obviously we need some criteria. All right, so I'm just going to say here, one of the problems with Tocqueville, he doesn't really, he's not rigorous enough, is what Dahl is saying. And he comes through and says, hey, here's what he said. Now I'm going to be a little bit more rigorous, and here's some better criteria, and to try to figure out if someone's being unjust. But it's a problem to figure out in the democracy, how can you say that the majority is being unjust? Doesn't the majority actually determine what's just or not? That's where you have the problem there. Right? Yeah, and we don't need to get into this, but basically he's reasoning about, is it possible for a democracy? Is there anything else like I want to say the Winston Churchill quote, democracy's the worst form of, we could say, political environment or society, except for all the others. They're all worse. Right. And so you have this kind of, we should ask ourselves whether any alternative kind of regime that is some kind of non-democratic regime would ensure greater liberty to its people, right? Even if the democratic regimes are shown to be superior to non-democratic regimes in ensuring liberty among their people, do they nonetheless frequently injure fundamental rights and liberties? If so, to what extent does this impairment of liberty result from equality and majority rule? So these are some kind of pieces of context and criteria for trying to judge if something unjust is happening. And you got to compare it to, hey, do we have more liberty in the, counterintuitively, in the authoritarian regime when we have more liberties, right? So that's what he's saying there. let's see here. Yeah, I mean, he was going through and writing about the United States, and it's paradoxical, in 1832, despite slavery, harsh violence against the native Indian population, and the legal subjection of women, a higher proportion, right? So this is might be controversial to some, but a higher proportion of Americans enjoyed a greater degree of political freedom and civil liberty than had the people in any regime then existing or any earlier regime, with the possible exceptions of classical Athens and Roman Republic, right? So he's trying to say, hey, this thing over there, there's some definite problems, but they got something going on over there. All right. So we're still talking about majority tyranny, and this is a big section. So violations of basic liberties, two bodies of rights, right? Economic rights, so that's property rights and political rights. So these two are always in conflict, right? Economic rights, political rights. Fundamental political rights would include the right to vote, free speech, free inquiry, the right to seek and hold public office, and to free, fair, and moderately frequent elections, and the right to form political associations, including political parties. Let's call these the primary political rights. So he's building up an argument here, and he's going to try to give a solution here later. But again, these are political rights, and he's going to contrast this with, the formation of these political rights, and you got the paradox of, well, what if the democracy gets together and votes to get rid of their own political rights? That's what we're wrestling with, and how do you get out of that, right? And all right, here we go. To what extent do equality and democracy endanger primary political rights? All right, so we're finally here, right? Important. All right. The historical record seems to show a fairly steady strengthening and expansion of primary political rights in democratic countries. In all democratic countries, the suffrage, its ability for people to vote, right, for example, is much broader today than in the United States in 1830. In several important respects, the United States has been a deviant case. Here, racial minorities suffered a deprivation of fundamental political human rights unequal in any other democratic country, both in the number of persons victimized and the severity of the deprivation. All right, now we have this. So this might be in your head intuitive, like there's something, and you have theories for this, where, reasoning about rights. Okay. So in the theory of prior rights, fundamental rights, including political rights, are in some sense interior to democracy. They possess a moral existence, right? So you kind of, in the back of your head, you might have the saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that every man, has these rights or whatever, right? And that's kind of prior to the Constitution, or prior to Declaration of Independence, or prior, right? These possess a moral existence, a standing, an ontological basis, if you will, altogether independent of democracy and democratic processes. Independent, right? So this might, at this point, seem like almost like a just so story, or okay, why are these independent? So this is what the crux of the problem. In this view, certain fundamental rights are not only interior to democracy, but superior to it. Okay. Superior to it, right? They serve as limits of what can be done, within the democratic process. In the theory of prior rights, then fundamental political rights are seen as rights a citizen is entitled to exercise if need be against the democratic process. So think of like Bill of Rights, right? You're not supposed to be able to have those taken away from you, right? It follows that to preserve fundamental political rights and liberties, a people must protect them from infringement by, among other things, a citizen body acting through the democratic process itself. So now you can net some of the pushback against tyranny of majority. And remember, there's the legal and there's the legitimate. I like that word, or the just, right? You can say, oh, the majority wants to do all this, but it's illegitimate. It's not just. And that's a big part of what the author is trying to pull out of Tocqueville and kind of reason about and build up a fundamental framework for critiquing economic rights and liberties and stuff and versus political. All right. So here's kind of getting closer to what the author's solution is. The right to self-government through the democratic process itself is one of the most fundamental rights that a person can possess. Indeed, if any rights can be said to be inalienable, surely these or this must be among them. On this reasoning, right, a set of basic political rights can be derived from one of the most fundamental rights of all rights to which human beings are entitled, the right of self-government. So he's contrasting this style of thinking about rights to this one up here, which is theory of prior rights. The theory of prior rights, where you got a whole group. Then you have this one, which is kind of like you have one big one, self-government. And then you can get all these other ones from this one. So you can kind of get, so he's setting up a paradox and he's setting up a way to try to get away from the paradox. So if you do that, if you say all the other rights come from this one, right to self-government, then you can no longer confront a straightforward conflict between the liberty on one side and equality or democracy on the other. For if democracy itself is a fundamental right, then the person's fundamental liberty consists in part of the opportunity to exercise that right. All right, so now you have the beginning of this rationale based on Tocqueville, but this beginning of this rationale or to create a framework for saying when something is illegitimate, even if it was voted on by the majority, right? So that's what we just did. Any questions so far? I know it's kind of a winding road. All right. I'm going to move forward. We got some more on the tyranny of majority. So 2 cases. Again, this is developing the argument of tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of the majority. So you have 2 cases: a majority versus the rights of a minority, and the majority versus democracy itself. Right. So majority versus minority. A majority is entitled to use its primary political rights to deprive a minority of its primary political rights. All right. So as a question, the answer is sometimes presented as a paradox. If a majority cannot do so, then in effect, it is deprived of its own rights. But if it can do so, then it's deprived of the minority of its rights. So that's one side of the paradox. And right, so kind of damned if you will, damned if you don't kind of thing. a question of whether the majority may rightly, again, that word, justly, rightly, legitimately, as separate from legally, right, may rightly use its primary political rights to deprive a minority of its primary political rights. And he's saying clearly no, right? Logically, it cannot be true that a given aggregate of persons ought to govern themselves by the democratic processes, and that a majority of those persons may properly strip a minority of their primary political rights. Okay, fine, right? Again, going back, he gave the solution to that previously. It's based off of, you're basically undercutting your legitimacy if you're saying, oh, I'm the democratic process, I'm going to get rid of that for this group over there. Oh no, well, whatever arguments you would use for that, including the democratic process, you're undercutting yourself, right? Same thing here. Majority versus democracy, it's basically the same thing, right? So majority basically says, we don't like democracy. Let's vote for the strong man. It's the way that they phrase it, or the authoritarian, or whatever. Let's do it. Well, you're going to legitimately undercut yourself. It's not going to be a legitimate thing. It's inalienable, right? So that's what that's about. So we made it through this. So this is a good one for talking about tyranny of the majority. It's a mass-based despotism. We're going to get into these examples, which seems like, have people really done this? Yeah, they have. Is the coexistence of democracy, equality, and primary political rights often, perhaps typically, no more than a transitional state between the birth of a new democratic order and its transformation into a mass-based despotism. Tocqueville seems to have been drawn more and more to an idea roughly along these lines. So he made a prediction that this is going to happen. The tyranny of majority is basically going to create an authoritarian state. And he had this, this is all Tocqueville. I keep saying Tocqueville, but it's Tocqueville. Basically, he's saying that whole thing where I said crumbs in a circus. It's basically that. There's two ways to interpret it. One is, and he's his way of describing it is, people that are in a democracy are kind of going to become more and more atomized, right? They're only going to see their own kids and people immediately around them. They're going to say, okay, I care about this small group. And then they're going to essentially say, you know what I want? I want happiness, right? And so I'm going to vote for that. So a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent of and the only arbiter of that happiness, right? So they're going to do that more and more. All right. That's going to be their principal concern. And, thus every day renders the exercise of the free agency of man less useful and less frequent. And it circumscribes the will to a narrow range. Yeah. And the principle of equality has prepared men for these things. It has predisposed men to endure them and oftentimes to look to them as benefits. So essentially, equality, right? They're not because the people are atomized, they're not going to care so much about the rights, let's say property rights of those further away from them. And they're basically going to say, oh, no, I don't care. Let me have their stuff or something like that, right? And so that's kind of, you could look at it. The author Dahl is saying you can interpret Tocqueville as foreshadowing the growth of a welfare state. But he says, but here's another way. Let us suppose that Tocqueville view the equality he believes so characteristic of democratic countries would be peculiarly conducive, given enough time to work its corrosive effects to the growth of widespread support for something vaguely like mass-based authoritarian regimes. that have been such an astounding feature of this century. So now we're getting into these examples. So he's saying, yeah, don't worry about the welfare state one. Worry about the authoritarian regimes one. Let's say that that's how you interpret. And so democracy requires equality, yet the degree of equality necessary for democracy to exist also carries with it a likelihood that the democratic regime will be transformed into a historically unprecedented form of despotism, authoritarianism. So he's saying, this is Tocqueville. He's saying it's likely that it will become an authoritarian, right? And so he has this conjecture. Democratic countries, the equality of condition that is necessary to democracy will, over the long run, tend to create a highly atomized society of isolated individuals and families, and to generate support among substantial majority of people for a regime that undertakes to satisfy widespread popular desires for security, income, shelter, comfort, and the like, while at the same time drastically curtailing political rights and destroying the democratic process. So this is what the author's saying. You can really just, concentrate it, condense it down to this statement. And so remember, he was writing before. This is, I believe he's writing in the, I guess 19th century, like 1800s. So among countries that have been democratic for a considerable period of time, and it brings us back to, again, to like cooperatives and all that. This is any democratic process. You have the draw for, hey, let's just go ahead and give this to the strong, smart person and let them control all of it. This is building that argument. So even within it's almost like it's a stronger argument when you try to apply it to a company, really. And so that's where we're going here. So among countries that have been democratic for a considerable period of time, let us say a generation or more, we should expect to find a significant number in which at least 3 observable changes take place as society becomes atomized, like democracy is replaced by an authoritarian regime, and this change of regime is both supported by and comes about largely as a consequence of widespread popular support. Now, we got these examples. The breakdown of democratic institutions and their supersession by authoritarian regimes in Italy, Germany, Austria, and Spain from 1923 to 1936 seemed to many observers to validate Tocqueville's conjecture. Now we're getting into where a lot of the, you could say, empirical political science comes from, where they debate, hey, there's a limit to democracy where you give too much and the people vote for a authoritarian regime, right? And so since the theory had mainly emphasized the atomization of society and support, so now he critiques the Tocqueville conjecture and says, yes, these were democratic states and that became authoritarian. And he says, well, here are the nuances there, right? So one argument is like the Germans weren't atomized, they were really based on class. So that was one. But he says, well, but other regimes were not like that. So here we go. I've been able to identify 13 cases in this century in which a democratic regime has been transformed into a dictatorship. These are Argentina, Austria, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Germany, Greece, Italy, Peru, Portugal, Spain, Venezuela, Uruguay. So it's a bunch. And then he goes in, and we're getting close to the end here, but he goes in and tries to critique that these were really fully formed democratic groups, right? And so most of these groups, they were only democratic for 20 years, right? Or all except for Uruguay. They were less than 20 years as democratic. That's one critique. So it seems like if you're going to say you're democratic and you're in danger of going to be an authoritarian, one of the big dangers is being only for like 20 years, like a short time. Then on top of that, they were really only partly democratic. They had a really strong oligarchy. And on top of that, a lot of them in the oligarchy, they were hostile to egalitarianism, political equality, democratic ideas, so on and so forth. Right. But one of the biggest for this subject, the biggest example people bring up is Germany. Germany actually democratically voted, doesn't say here, it says here, but he I want to say it was Hindenburg. They voted a social democrat as the I don't know what the president was called, but they voted him, and then he made Hitler Vice Chancellor or Chancellor. So, you know, you can have a democratic process, and then the argument is that Germany actually voted for to become a authoritarian regime or fascist regime. That of course the author, again, all those four qualifications, really was a pushback against this. So, saying the Nazis only won 44% of the vote and all this other stuff. But we don't really see this that often. That's a lot. Oh, wow. You know, Pretty shocking if you didn't know that there was a vote. Any questions so far before I roll it up for this chapter? Comments?
Yeah, were the Nazis really presenting themselves as authoritarian in that sense, or were they cosplaying as socialists?
Uh, well, I think the guy Hindenburg was definitely socialist, and he doesn't quote that guy here. I don't think he came through and said he was going to suspend civil rights when he was, you know, I don't think he was going to say that, you know, but
His comment seems to say that, oh, hey, wait a second, the Nazis were one. I mean, it's still, as you said, right? It's a lot, right? It says only, but it's oh my God, right?
yeah,
But at the same time, I mean, it says here that in an atmosphere of public insecurity and terror for communists and socialists.
yep,
So just thinking that, was there terror for communists and socialists? It seems that at the time they were actually pretty popular. Like the
in
labor movement
Germany.
was pretty strong in Germany. So I don't
Uh,
know. It was interesting.
yeah, I think there was a lot of turmoil going on. I Another book I read, I want to say it was really Trotsky. Uh, he talks about the contrast of Italy and Germany, and Spain. And he says Germany is really kind of a more advanced Italy in how the fascism took over. And he says, how can you possibly go from a socialism to a fascism. It should be opposites. And it's like, it's really this battle that happens with this, all the phrases that they use, petty bourgeoisie and all that, but basically the professional managers and people that are kind of not at the top tier, but right under them, they get basically bought off, convinced, and all that to fight, do violent against the workers. And once that happens, that's fascism. And he said that this uh Hindenburg, he was considered, Hitler, I believe, was considered to be the lesser of two evils. And Hindenburg was like weak. And he's like, oh, let's not fight. Let's not whatever. And then he was like, oh, let me go ahead and bring this guy in. And then that was it, because they're ready to fight. And so people were getting killed. There was some turmoil there. Even though, like what you said, it was strong. They were strong as numbers, but the argument is that they were weak in that they weren't ready to take up arms in Germany or Italy, if that makes sense, right? Strong in numbers, but not willing to fight, which is, I mean, for people who are like, oh, we should, be nonviolent. Well, the, there are certain situations where Italy and Germany, you're nonviolent, you get Italy and Germany. It's hard to try to imagine a scenario where nonviolence wins in Italy pre-fascism and as it's developed, if you know the history there, in Germany. That, I mean, it's controversial and obscene to say, but the people should have fought more there.
Yeah, that's what anti-fascists they always say. They know. It's like, hey, we know what's coming. If these guys rise into power, it's like we're getting whacked like
Yeah,
pretty fast.
yeah, that's so let's see here. All right, let's finish this thing off. This is the last piece. So uh was Tocqueville wrong? Not necessarily. He did not contend that democratic equalities made the destruction of liberty inevitable. He argued only that it would make it likely. Right. And then he goes on and says lots of people reference Tocqueville constantly for saying for his predictions, right? He's writing before Italy, Germany, Spain, all those other groups that were going to try democracy and fail. Um, and so they're like, see, we told you, you need to have, we could go back to our Pateman book, The Participatory Democracy, with the lots of references towards what the contrast of the contemporary view of democracy and participatory, or you could say classic view, and a contemporary view, which is forgetting his name now, uh the creative destruction guy, can't remember his name. um he was like, yeah, no, you don't want people participating because they're going to vote in an authoritarian regime, right? And so this is the paradox. Like, this is uh how much really a lot of political science, like it's really a majority view, that they believe in this Tocqueville threat conjecture. And so they'll point to all this, and this Dahl is really like almost like this, like a true believer. Like, oh no, you can have real democracy. Let's critique all these other uh groups that went into fascism. Um, so I'll just go highlighting there are some things that would have a strong democracy. Power and the Tocqueville, was saying you need to have um, power and social functions at being decentralized. And then, so United States had constitutional decentralization. Really, the other countries did not copy that for some reason so much. So we have these three branches, but we also have this setup where we have states and federal. So here, no other existing democratic country has closely copied our system, whose constitution provides much more decentralized power among relatively independent institutions than most other countries have thought either necessary or desirable. So that's one difference. So Dahl, in some of his other books, he talks about a lot about the constitutional, like every democracy is going to have some constitution with rights in it, period. So that's important. And then for the constitutional strength, and then I'm sorry, the democracy strength. But Tocqueville attributed even greater significance to the fourth factor, which he's calling manners, the manners of the people, which is basically this the attitudes that are transmitted and supported by the broader culture, belief systems, habits, manners, and mores. But basically, if people actually, the people there, if democracy is forced on them, hey, you're going to be democratic now, and they just are like, what? And they don't care about like free speech and all this stuff, then it's not gonna. You can go ahead and predict that it's gonna fail in 20 years, like what we saw with these other countries, right? So that's a big part of it as well, as he's saying. So I think we got through everything. It's 8:10. Any more comments? We've got the next chapter. We can try to get through 2 chapters next, maybe. But we're gonna dig more into and democracy, political equality, and economic liberty. And then the one after that, it's gonna be the one that's really about the power of corporations, work, how you work, as far as economics, and it's really the outsized influence on democracy and what we try to reason about what to do about it.